crew of the slave ship Zong were certain they hadn't committed a crime. They believed they'd carried out a routine risk management protocol, the kind any careful firm runs to shield its investors from a bad quarter. And the protocol, in this case, was putting 142 living people into the Atlantic Ocean. The number that authorized it was 30 pounds. That's what each of those people had been insured for. Not as passengers, not as human beings, but as cargo, the same way you'd insure a crate of sugar. And the policy had a small technical rule buried inside it, a rule about the difference between two ways cargo was allowed to die, that quietly turned a hold full of dying prisoners into a math problem with exactly one profitable answer. To understand how 30 pounds could kill someone, you have to understand what London had built by the 1780s. By then, the city ran the most sophisticated insurance market the world had ever made. A machine that could price a storm in an ocean it would never see, a fire in a warehouse it would never visit, and, somewhere in that same elegant arithmetic, a human being. The men who owned the Zong were a Liverpool syndicate led by a merchant named William Gregson. Call him the Liverpool Merchant. And he'd spent decades in the one business where the inventory could die before you sold it. He understood, better than most, that the way you survive a trade like that is you don't carry the risk yourself. You pool it, you insure it, you turn other people's deaths into someone else's liability. So when his syndicate got hold of a captured Dutch ship, a vessel the Dutch had named the Zorg, which happens to be their word for care, they did what careful men do. They renamed her the Zong and took out a policy with a London underwriter that valued the ship and the enslaved people aboard her at £8,000, fixed at £30 a head. A ship called Care, insured as freight, sailing under men who'd priced every soul on board. It's the kind of detail that would be too much for fiction, and which history apparently felt no need to keep tasteful. Here's the rule that mattered, the one buried in the fine print. If an enslaved person died on board of sickness or thirst or simple despair, a natural death in the language of the policy, the underwriter paid nothing, and that loss belonged entirely to the owners. But maritime law carried an old principle called general average, and it said something very different about cargo that was deliberately destroyed. If a captain threw goods overboard to save a ship from sinking, jettisoned them in a genuine emergency, then the loss was shared, and the underwriter had to pay the owners back in full. Picture the cargo insurance on a moving truck. If your furniture breaks on its own, that's your problem. But if the driver deliberately heaves it off the back to keep the truck from going over a cliff, the insurer covers every piece. The rule exists for a good reason. You want a captain to dump cargo rather than drown his crew. The Zong's owners had simply insured human beings as the cargo. And so the policy did something no one quite said out loud. It made a dying person and a drowned person worth two completely different amounts. That is what a price does to a person. It stops asking whether they should die and starts asking only which way of dying costs the company less. If the insurance built the trap, greed loaded it. The Zong was a small ship, 110 tons, which is a number that means more once you know what it was supposed to hold. A British slaver of that era carried somewhere near 2 enslaved people per ton, already a horror. The Zong's owners packed in 442. Run that arithmetic, and you get more than 4 people crushed into every ton of a ship rated for fewer than 2. Better than twice the standard density of a trade whose standard was already monstrous. Imagine a commuter train car built for 40, and then imagine 90 people pressed into it, and then imagine the doors sealed and the whole car lowered below the waterline for 3 months. Greed of this kind isn't reckless, it's precise. It knows exactly how many bodies will fit in a hold and exactly which margin of safety to delete to make the spreadsheet close. Then there was the question of who was in charge. Command of the Zong went to Luke Collingwood, call him the surgeon captain, a man who had spent his whole career as a ship's doctor and had never once commanded a vessel. This was his first time, and his only. He'd spent years learning to look at an enslaved person and read their physical condition, and on the Zong, he used precisely that skill, not to keep anyone alive, but to sort them, to appraise the hold the way you'd appraise a warehouse. And for most of the crossing, he was dying himself, too sick to truly run anything, which left the ship under a first mate who soon fell out with him and got suspended, and then under a passenger, an old slave ship captain who happened to be aboard, handed the wheel almost by accident. The detail that sealed everything was the smallest one. At a provisioning stop on the island of São Tomé, the ship's cooper, the one man whose entire job was building and sealing the water casks, fell ill and couldn't work, and no one checked his work for him. The Zong sailed on with casks that had never been properly sealed, leaking the whole time. Weeks later, the crew went below and found that a great share of their fresh water had simply drained away into the bottom of the ship. Every disaster about to happen, the thirst, the desperation, the supposed emergency that would justify all of it, was already built into the ship before she ever met any trouble. The overcrowding, the unsealed casks, the captain who couldn't captain, none of it was the sea's doing. It was the company's. The voyage that should have taken 6 weeks stretched past 3 months, the ship becalmed and crawling, the people below dying at a rate the policy refused to pay for. By late November, more than 60 of the enslaved and 4 of the crew were already dead, every one of them, in the eyes of the underwriter, a total loss the owners would have to swallow whole. Then came the navigation. On the 18th of November, the Zong sighted the island of Tobago, which meant a chance to take on water, and the first mate, surveying what was left in the casks, decided they had enough and sailed past. 9 days later, the lookout sighted the hills of Jamaica, the actual destination, about 27 miles off. And here the most expensive mistake of the whole voyage was made by a man whose name we don't even have. A crewman looked at Jamaica and decided it was Saint-Domingue, French territory, enemy water. And the crew, afraid of French warships, turned hard away from the one island they'd spent 4 months trying to reach. By the time anyone realized what they'd done, the Zong was roughly 300 miles downwind of Jamaica, and getting back meant beating against the wind for 10 to 14 days. Now consider what just happened. A ship already bleeding water from casks it never sealed had just sailed 300 miles in the wrong direction because it mistook its own destination for the enemy. And the people who would pay for that mistake were chained in a hold that hadn't done any of it. The second count of the water was the one that mattered. They had, by their own reckoning, a single day's full ration left, 2 quarts a person, and 14 days still to sail. And in that gap between 1 day of water and 14 days of sailing, the officers found the loophole. They knew the math of the policy as well as they knew the math of the water. Every person who died below of thirst was 30 pounds the owners would never see. Every person thrown overboard alive in the name of saving the ship was 30 pounds the underwriter was bound to pay. An emergency, it turns out, is a wonderful thing to a system that has already decided what it wants. It turns a choice into a necessity, and a necessity into a defense. On the evening of the 29th of November, the crew began. They started with the people the Caribbean market valued least, 54 women and children, and brought them up to the cabin. It's after dark on the deck, and the lanterns throw long shadows across the boards. There's the sound of the cabin window opening, the cold push of night air, and then a sound against the water below, and then another, and another, spaced out the way a man works a task he's been told is just a task. The sea takes each one without changing. The crew don't look down. 2 days later, they took a second group, 42 men, up onto the deck. And it's here, in the worst of it, that the only defiance left was taken by the men themselves. 10 of them broke the shackles off their own wrists and went over the side on their own terms, choosing the water rather than letting the crew turn them into a payout. And then the sky opened. On the night of the 1st of December, after the first 2 groups were already gone, the rain came. On the deck, it comes down hard enough to sting, drumming on the boards, sheeting off the canvas the crew have rigged to catch it, and the casks fill, one, then the next, with the exact thing they'd been killing people to save. The men stand in it, soaked through, watching fresh water pour from the sky for free. Below them, the hold is quieter than it was a week ago. It rained for more than a day. They caught 6 full casks, enough to carry every living soul aboard for another 11 days. The emergency was over. The thirst was answered. The reason they'd given for everything they'd done had just fallen out of the sky and filled their barrels. And they kept killing. Over the following days, they brought up a third group, 36 more men, and put them into the sea as well. Not because the ship was dying, because it wasn't anymore, but because the people in the hold were still sick, still dying slowly, still worth nothing as a natural death, and 30 pounds apiece as a jettison. That's the tell. Necessity was never steering the ship. The ledger was, and a ledger doesn't stop being hungry just because it started to rain. 2 quarts of water. That was the daily ration the crew swore they couldn't spare. To protect it, 142 people went into the sea. When the Zong finally reached Black River, Jamaica, on the 22nd of December, 208 people were left alive out of the 442 who had been loaded. The survivors were sold that January for an average of 36 pounds a head and put to work in the sugar fields, where a person's life expectancy ran to about 3 years. A person who died in the hold was worth nothing. A person sold alive was worth 36 pounds. But a person thrown overboard was worth a guaranteed 30, and to men running the numbers, a sure 30 beat a hoped-for 36 every time. And when officials looked into the ship's stores, they found 420 gallons of fresh water still sitting in the hold, the one fact that turned the whole story from a tragedy of the sea into something the law would eventually have to look at directly. The logbook, the single document that recorded the timing of all of it, had vanished by the time anyone thought to ask for it. So the owners filed an insurance claim. They wanted their money, 30 pounds for each of the people who had gone over the side. And when the underwriter refused to pay, the Liverpool Merchant Syndicate took him to court. Not a court about murder, a court about money. The case was called Gregson versus Gilbert, and from first word to last, it was argued as a commercial dispute, the way you'd argue over a damaged shipment of timber. At the first trial, the jury sided with the owners. The killing of more than 100 people was, the court agreed, a legitimate way to manage cargo in an emergency, and the underwriter was ordered to pay nearly £4,000, which was simply the 30-pound price tag multiplied out, attached to the dead. The underwriter appealed, and the case went up before the Lord Chief Justice, and even there, in the highest commercial court in the country, no one rose to ask the obvious question. The judges spent 2 days on the Zong without once being required to decide whether a killing had taken place, which, given what the case was actually about, is a striking thing to leave off the agenda. What they decided instead came down to paperwork. The owner's lawyers had told the court the deaths were forced by perils of the sea, bad currents, a leaking hull, acts of God. The underwriter's lawyers proved something else entirely, that the water shortage came from the crew's own incompetence, the unsealed casks, and the 300-mile blunder. That more than 5 barrels of water were still aboard when the killing began, and that the rain had ended any possible emergency before the final group died. The court found what it called a fatal variance, a fatal mismatch, between what the owners had claimed and what had actually happened. The payout got thrown out the way a case gets tossed when the paperwork names the wrong street. The court never ruled on whether the killing was wrong, only that the form had been filled in incorrectly. The verdict was set aside, and a new trial ordered. A second trial never happened. No member of the crew was ever charged with the death of a single person. But the transcript of that cold commercial argument fell into the hands of a formerly enslaved writer living in London, who carried it to an abolitionist named Granville Sharp. Call him the abolitionist. And Sharp did the one thing the system never expected anyone to do with its paperwork. He published it. He paid a man to take down every word, then sent the account to the Admiralty, to the Prime Minister, to anyone who would receive it. And when they ignored him, he handed it to the press. And the sterile arithmetic of Gregson versus Gilbert put the slave trade on trial in the public mind for the first time. Within a few years, Parliament had written a new rule. No underwriter could ever again pay a claim on an enslaved person thrown overboard, on any account whatsoever. The loophole was sealed. The trade was not yet, but the safety net the merchants had leaned on was gone, and they were left to carry the full weight of their own cargo. Lloyd's still trades today, a few streets from where that policy was written, and the rule the Zong forced into the law, the one forbidding any payout on a person thrown overboard, sits on the books for exactly one reason. Because a syndicate once tried to collect. The horror of the Zong was never that the crew went mad, or broke the rules, or did something the system would have condemned. The horror is the opposite. They followed the rules exactly. The insurance, the valuation, the careful distinction between a death that paid and a death that didn't, all of it worked precisely as designed. And the men who built it never had to picture a single face, because the paperwork did the not picturing for them. A system protects itself first by putting a price on harm, and then by giving the harm a name so clean that no one in the room ever has to see it. The court records survive, careful and complete, every shilling accounted for to the penny, and not one of them holds a single name of the 142, because the men who wrote everything down had never once thought to ask. Somewhere right now, a number is being entered into a spreadsheet that turns a human cost into an acceptable loss, a recall not issued, a claim quietly denied. In words so reasonable, the person typing them will go home certain they did nothing wrong. Just like the men on the Zong, who were, by the rules they'd been handed, correct.